Okay, in terms of the world we are in, it's apparent that we are confronted by a series of existential threats. Existential threats means threats to the future of civilization, or perhaps the world as we know it. One of these is greenhouse gas emissions, GHG, and how greenhouse gases contribute to climate change. Climate change, in turn, has an impact on biodiversity. Biodiversity is a necessity for human life as well as other life on the planet. And ultimately, as the diagram at the bottom or the picture at the bottom shows, there is a question of the sea level, which is particularly relevant to those of us who live on islands. Because as the sea level rises, we will be living in an archipelago rather than an island. And it's not only environmental issues that are constituting an existential threat. We also have a worsening income distribution within countries. It's very important not to overstate this rich running ahead of the poor because in my lifetime, there has been a very substantial improvement in the material conditions of the world's poor. Okay? So it is quite realistic now, for example, to imagine meeting the Sustainable Development Goal, which I'll talk about in just a moment, of eradicating extreme poverty. Okay? We're actually on track to doing that. We're not so on track to eliminating poverty as nationally defined, which is one of the other facets of the income distribution goal. But the disparity between income and wealth is creating serious problems. And finally, increases in waste and the depletion of resources. I'm more skeptical than some of my colleagues about the magnitude of peak, whatever it is, manganese, oil, whatever, because innovation does tend to extend the resource base along with exhaustion. But at the end of the day, the world is finite, and the rates of exploitation of resources are exponential. So there is a crunch at some point between availability and use. Well, that's sort of the bad news. The good news is that there is international recognition of a number of these issues in the form of the Sustainable Development Goals. And that these have been broadly adopted as a desired policy by both the global North and the global South. So many governments are trying to position their policies, their actions, in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, if you open these boxes, then you'll find that there are a lot of detailed sub-goals within these goals. And the degree of, shall we say, seriousness with which people are addressing the sub-goals differs across countries. But at least there's a large global consensus that these are worthwhile goals for humanity as a whole to address. But there isn't a blueprint for attaining these goals. Okay? We have actions that we think might be relevant. They might take us in the direction of meeting the goals, but by no means is there a blueprint. And that is particularly a problem when we think about what is the nature of change that's required. And here's the first of the concepts that want to get across that varies from our ordinary understanding of how technology and society interact. And it's the idea of a socio-technical system. And a socio-technical system is not a sector of the economy, nor is it a techno-economic system which is about a market. It's a much more expansive idea that includes not only the actors who are suppliers, but also those people that consume goods and services within a particular area. And in fact, in that regard, it's better to start from the idea that socio-technical systems are defined by human purposes and needs. The idea of socio-technical systems is meant to include not only various things that are material, both production and consumption, but also cultural meanings and symbolic meanings in these systems, socio-technical systems. So, for example, I grew up in a state famous for making automobiles, and the state where Detroit was located. So in my life, I've participated in automobile culture. And automobile culture had a lot of symbolic meanings, okay? Automobiles as status symbols, automobiles as independence, automobiles as teenage sexual adventure opportunities, okay? These were all symbolic or cultural meanings of the automobile. So a socio-technical system is inclusive of a variety of ways to think about how technologies and people interact. Simone.
Thank you very much. Given your definition of socio-technical systems, how many socio-technical systems are there?
That's a question which has two answers. One is there are as many as you would like for the purpose of analysis. Okay? On the other hand, you want to have a socio-technical system be sufficiently broad that you're talking about the common need or common purposes of a large number of people. Otherwise, the system aspect breaks down. Okay? So at one point, one could talk about the socio-technical system of comic books. And in that case, it was a very narrow specific audience, age delimited, and so forth and so on. Today, that's not the case. It's a much broader system. I'd still have some problems with that as a socio-technical system because separating it from other parts of publishing and other leisure activities or leisure activities that people might engage in is a bit of a challenge. But it depends on your purposes of analysis. So you can view society as a collection of these socio-technical systems, and doing so emphasizes the interdependencies between human purposes, technologies, customs, and habits of thought in both supply and use. So an example that we use of such a system is mobility. Okay? So the automobile plays a role in the socio-technical system of mobility, but so does the bicycle and transport and walking. Okay? All the means to go from point A to B, to move about, are within the mobility socio-technical system. And when we begin to think of the problem not as an artifact, not as how a machine will take you from point A to point B, but to think about human needs to move from A to B, then we can think of a larger variety of solutions for how mobility can be achieved. And this expansion in the opportunities for addressing human needs is a key feature that a socio-technical system viewpoint brings to the table. The bottom line here is that meeting the Sustainable Development Goals is something that will require a very fundamental change in the socio-technical systems that we are currently employing, how they are currently constituted. And that's because we need to make what we are calling a deep transition. And the deep transition in industrial times has happened once. And it largely happened in this country with the increasing consumption of coal as a fuel. What did coal allow? Coal allowed us to escape from the current output of the sun. Insolation is a technical term for it, which is what the sun does in terms of bringing wind and rain, to bring windmills to make grind grain, water to similarly grind grain and use water power, that grain to feed animals, the animals to do mechanical work, but it also to feed us to do mechanical work. These are the energy sources prior to the intensive use of fossil fuels. We have a little bit on the side with the burning of wood, but if you think about it for a moment, wood is a relatively recent product of the sun. The sun wasn't shining, we wouldn't have wood to burn in our fireplaces. What fossil fuels do is allow us to consume the accumulation of millions of years of human, not human, but pre-human civilization, not civilization, life on Earth, okay? So that pre-human development that laid down the deposits of coal, and as we later exploit, petroleum, provide a boost, a gain. Largely, that can be associated with the very substantial improvement in human welfare over the past 250 years. It's very questionable whether we would have a degree of advancement that we do without having tapped into fossil fuels. However, it hasn't worked out so well because the burning of fossil fuels contributes to the greenhouse gas burden and ultimately is responsible for the climate change existential threat that I discussed a moment ago. So when I say that the world needs to have fundamental change in socio-technical systems, what I'm talking about is making another deep transition, a severing of our reliance on fossil fuels in order to achieve a more sustainable future for ourselves and future generations.